Major Elias Thorne of the United States Army Air Corps was a man who believed in the industrialization of death. In the summer of 1941, he was stationed at the British Middle East Command in Cairo as a tactical observer. His job was to report back to Washington on why the British Empire was losing the war against Erwin Rommel. To Thorne, a man trained in the doctrine of massed logistics and aerial supremacy, the answer was obvious. The British were fighting a 20th century war with a 19th century soul. "Cairo is a city of ghosts and tea time," Thorne wrote in a classified dispatch to the Pentagon. "The British officers spend their mornings at the Turf Club and their afternoons moving wooden blocks on maps that Rommel has already invalidated. They believe in the fair fight. They believe in armored divisions clashing in the desert like knights. But Rommel isn't a knight. He's a mechanic. He has more tanks, better fuel lines, and an air force, the Luftwaffe, that treats the Royal Air Force like target practice. By every calculation of American industrial warfare, the British should evacuate the Mediterranean by Christmas. They are obsessed with the arithmetic of the front line, but they have no front line. They only have a desert that is eating them alive." Thorne's skepticism was rooted in the failure of the commandos. The British had tried sending large-scale raiding forces, hundreds of men in boats, to strike Rommel's ports. These missions, like Operation Layforce, had been catastrophic. They were too large to be stealthy and too small to hold ground. They were tactical hybrids that failed at both ends of the spectrum. "I told the British General Staff that the era of the roving band was over," Thorne recalled. "I told them that war in the 1940s required 1,000 bomber raids and 500 tank breakthroughs. You don't win a war with a knife. You win it with a factory." But the British were desperate.
They were so desperate that they allowed a man with a broken back to walk into their headquarters and hand them a piece of paper that sounded like a suicide note written by a madman. The man was David Stirling. He was a 6-foot 6-inch subaltern in the Scots Guards, a man known to his peers as a giant of a slacker who spent more time in the bars of Cairo than on the parade ground. But 2 months earlier, Stirling had jumped out of a plane with an experimental parachute that failed. He hit the ground at terminal velocity and shattered his spine. "He should have been a vegetable," Thorne noted. He spent 2 months in a hospital bed in Cairo, paralyzed from the waist down, staring at the ceiling. Most men would have been looking for a way out of the army. Stirling was looking for a way to delete the Luftwaffe. He lay in that bed with a pencil and a notebook, and he performed a surgical audit of the entire North African War. He realized that the British were losing because they were looking at the desert as a wall. He saw it as an ocean. On a sweltering morning in July 1941, Thorne was sitting in the Grey Columns, the heavily fortified British headquarters in Cairo. Security was absolute. There were checkpoints, barbed wire, and armed sentries every 10 meters. No one entered without a top-secret clearance. "And then I saw him," Thorne said. "A giant, limping figure in a crumpled uniform, moving on crutches. He didn't have a pass. He didn't have an appointment. I watched as he approached the main gate. When the sentry challenged him, Stirling didn't argue. He just waited until a truck created a distraction, and then he hopped, literally hopped on his crutches, over the fence and disappeared into the shadows of the building. He bypassed the entire security apparatus of the British Empire because he understood the acoustic shadow of the checkpoint." He knew that if you move with enough audacity, people assume you belong there. Stirling didn't go to the junior officers. He hobbled straight into the office of the Deputy Chief of Staff, General Ritchie. He walked in, bleeding from his stitches, and laid a 3-page memo on the desk. "I was in the room when Ritchie read it," Thorne recalled. The general's face went from anger to confusion to a kind of terrified awe. The memo was titled L-Detachment. It didn't ask for a battalion. It didn't ask for tanks. It asked for 60 men and 5 trucks. It proposed a new geometry of destruction. Stirling's logic was a direct attack on Thorne's industrial doctrine. The memo stated, "One aircraft destroyed on the ground by a man with a 2-pound bomb is tactically equivalent to an aircraft shot down in an aerial dogfight that costs £10,000 and the life of a pilot. The desert is not a battlefield. It is a void. If we enter the void in groups of 5, we are invisible to the radar and the patrols. We do not fight the enemy. We remove his capacity to fight." It was the birth of the thinking soldier, Thorne wrote. Stirling argued that the ultimate force multiplier wasn't a bigger bomb, but a human brain that had been flattened by the environment until it could function as a ghost. He called it the philosophy of the grueling approach. He told Ritchie, "Give me the men who have nothing left to lose but their pride, and I will give you Rommel's head on a platter." The Pentagon observers laughed when they heard about the memo. They called it the bedside fantasy. They believed that 60 men in the middle of a million-man war were a statistical zero. "I told my superiors that Stirling was a romantic relic of the 19th century," Thorne admitted. "I was convinced that he and his 60 men would be swallowed by the Sahara within 48 hours. I didn't understand that Stirling wasn't building a unit. He was building a different species of soldier, the kind of man who would eventually lead to the 17-second clearance in Baghdad and the 14-day wall in Belfast." But the bedside memo was about to be tested in the most brutal laboratory on Earth, the Great Sand Sea. As the sun began to bake the Cairo streets, General Auchinleck gave Stirling the go. He gave him a training camp at Cabrit and 60 volunteers. He told him, "Prove the geometry, or die in the sand." Major Elias Thorne was sent to Cabrit to document what he believed was a funeral in the making. What he witnessed instead was the moment the different species first stepped out of the hospital bed and into the fire. Cabrit was not a military base. It was a topographical insult. Located on the edge of the Great Bitter Lake, 80 miles from the civilization of Cairo, it was a stretch of salt flats and shifting dunes where the temperature reached 120 degrees by noon, and the wind blew with the abrasive force of a carpenter's rasp. Major Elias Thorne, arriving in August 1941 to document the progress of L-Detachment, was convinced that Stirling had chosen the location as a form of elaborate psychological torture. "There were no barracks," Thorne recalled. "There were no tents. There wasn't even a fence. I saw 60 men sitting in the dirt, cleaning their weapons with rags soaked in gasoline because there was no oil. They looked less like a British Special Operations unit and more like a band of stranded pirates." I asked Stirling where his supply line was. He just pointed at the horizon and said, "Elias, a supply line is just a leash. We're learning how to live without the leash. If a man can't steal what he needs from the desert, he won't be able to steal Rommel's planes." This was the first iteration of the Brecon filter, the selection process that would eventually become the gold standard of the regiment. But in 1941 it was raw, unscientific, and lethal. Stirling didn't have a manual. He had a philosophy of biological attrition. Stirling didn't want the strongest men, Thorne noted. He wanted the ones who were cognitively resilient. He would take these men on 40-mile marches through the dunes with no water, just to see which ones stopped thinking about the pain and started thinking about the navigation. He was looking for the autonomous engine. He told me, "A soldier who needs a sergeant to tell him to keep walking is a liability in the deep desert. I need the man who is his own sergeant." Thorne watched the training with a mixture of professional horror and fascination.
To simulate parachute jumps, Stirling had the men leap from the back of moving trucks at 30 miles per hour onto the hard-packed sand. Bones were broken, necks were snapped. In any American unit, the commanding officer would have been court-martialed for criminal negligence. I told Stirling he was destroying his own force before they even saw a German, Thorne said. He looked at me with those cold, aristocratic eyes and replied, "I'm not destroying them, Elias. I'm finding out which ones are already broken. The desert is a vacuum. It sucks the soul out of a weak man. I'd rather they break here than on the runway at Gazala." But while Stirling was the soul of the unit, the thinking soldier had a second architect, Jock Lewes. Lewes was a Welshman, a former Oxford rowing blue, and a tactical genius who looked at the geometry of destruction as a chemical problem. Lewes realized that the standard British explosives were too heavy and too weak, Thorne explained. They were using sticky bombs and heavy charges that required a man to carry 20 pounds of gear to kill one plane. Lewes spent his nights in a makeshift lab at Cabrit, mixing plastic explosive with thermite and oil. He created the Lewes Bomb, a 1-pound device that could be carried in a pocket. It didn't just explode, it burned at 3,000 degrees. It turned an aircraft's engine housing into a molten puddle in seconds. It was the first surgical instrument of the SAS. Thorne realized then that the different species wasn't just about physical toughness. It was about technical audacity. The SAS were the first unit to realize that in modern warfare, a man with a pound of chemistry is more dangerous than a platoon with a machine gun. By November 1941, Stirling was ready to prove his memo. The target was a series of 5 Luftwaffe airfields in the Cyrenaica region. The mission was designated Operation Squatter. It was to be the first combat parachute drop in British history. The American observers at the Pentagon were watching the weather reports, Thorne recalled. A massive storm system, the Ghibli, was moving across the Mediterranean. Winds were gusting at 60 miles per hour. Visibility was 0. I told the British air liaison that the jump was a death sentence. No pilot could find the drop zone in that weather, and no paratrooper could survive the landing. But Stirling was under pressure. The general staff in Cairo were already looking for an excuse to shut him down. He had to go. On the night of November 16th, 62 men of L-Detachment boarded 5 Bristol-Bombay transports. Thorne stood on the tarmac, watching the planes disappear into a sky that looked like a wall of black ink. It was a massacre of the geometry, Thorne wrote in his after-action report. The planes were buffeted by the gale. The pilots were lost. The men were dropped from 800 feet into a 50-knot crosswind. They were scattered across 50 miles of desert. Some were dragged to death by their parachutes. Some landed in the middle of German camps. Some simply disappeared into the void. Operation Squatter was a total, unmitigated disaster. Not a single bomb was planted. Not a single plane was destroyed. 48 hours later, Thorne was back at the headquarters in Cairo when the first survivors returned. Out of the 62 men who had jumped, only 22 made it back. Stirling was among them, his face shredded by the sand, his uniform a collection of rags. "I expected him to surrender," Thorne said. "I thought this was the end of the bedside fantasy. I told him, 'David, the machine won, the environment won. You can't fight a storm with a parachute.'" Stirling didn't even look at me. He was staring at a map. He looked at the 21 survivors, the men who had walked 80 miles through a gale with no water, and he said, "The parachute was the error, Elias, not the mission. We don't need the sky. We have the sand." This was the pivot of the ghost. Stirling realized that the different species didn't need to jump from planes to be invisible. They could use the desert itself as their high-altitude platform. He sought out a group of men that the British Army had ignored, the Long Range Desert Group, LRDG. These were the desert rats, New Zealanders and Rhodesians who had spent 2 years learning how to navigate the trackless dunes in unarmored Chevrolet trucks. Stirling proposed a marriage of convenience, Thorne noted. The LRDG would be the taxis, the navigation specialists who could drive through the impassable sand sea. The SAS would be the passengers, the technicians of destruction. I told the Pentagon that the British were doubling down on their madness. They were going to try and drive 500 miles behind enemy lines in open trucks to do what an air force couldn't do. Major Elias Thorne wrote Stirling's obituary that night. He was convinced that the 22 survivors were just ghosts, waiting for their graves to be dug. What he didn't know was that he had just witnessed the Brecon filter in its most perfect form.
The 40 men who had died in the storm were the attrition. The 22 who remained were the standard. And the geometry of the sand was about to unleash a level of violence that would make Erwin Rommel question the very nature of the war he was fighting. Major Elias Thorne sat in the passenger seat of a Chevrolet WB truck, his lungs filled with the fine, alkaline dust of the Libyan plateau. It was December 1941. To his left was a New Zealander from the Long Range Desert Group, LRDG, a man who hadn't shaved in 3 months and who navigated the trackless void of the Sahara using a sun compass and a pocket watch. Behind them, huddled in the back of the truck, were 4 men from L-Detachment SAS. I was witnessing a marriage of the acoustic shadow and the navigation of the void, Thorne wrote in a letter he hoped would reach Washington. The Americans believe that to move an army, you need a road. To supply an army, you need a railhead. But the LRDG and the SAS had realized that the Sahara wasn't a barrier. It was a permissive flank. The Germans and Italians had built their entire defensive line facing east, toward the British 8th Army. They had left their back door, the Great Sand Sea, unlocked because they believed no human being could cross it and arrive in a condition to fight. They were relying on the logic of the map. But David Stirling was relying on the standard of the ghost. The LRDG were the taxis of the desert. They were specialists in a form of primitive data processing. While Thorne's colleagues in the Air Corps were developing early radar, the LRDG were using the Bagnold Sun Compass, a simple device that allowed them to maintain a heading across a featureless landscape of shifting dunes. It was a technical paradox, Thorne noted. The most advanced military in the world, the Wehrmacht, was being bypassed by men using technology from the 18th century. The SAS trucks didn't have radios that worked over 50 miles. They didn't have armor. They were open-top targets. I told the LRDG captain that a single Messerschmitt could wipe us out in 10 seconds. He just pointed at the sun and said, "Major, the Messerschmitt is looking for a cloud of dust. We are moving at the speed of the wind. We don't exist until we want to." The different species was beginning to take shape in the heat. Thorne watched the SAS operators, men like Paddy Mayne, a former Irish rugby international who possessed a controlled volcanic energy. In the American system, Mayne would have been court-martialed for his unpredictability. In the SAS, he was the surgical blade. Mayne didn't talk about the mission, Thorne recalled. He talked about the vulnerability of the aluminium. He had spent his nights at Cabrit studying the blueprints of the Junkers Ju-52 and the Messerschmitt Bf-110. He knew exactly where the fuel lines intersected the oxygen tanks. He wasn't a commando looking for a brawl. He was a forensic saboteur. He told me, "Elias, why kill a pilot who takes 20 years to grow
when I can kill his plane in 20 seconds with a pound of plastic? A pilot without a plane is just a civilian in a fancy jacket. On the night of December 14th, 1941, the geometry of the sand reached its first point of intersection, Tamet Airfield. Tamet was a critical Luftwaffe hub located deep behind the front lines. It was protected by the inertia of security. The German pilots were sleeping in villas near the runway. The sentries were patrolling the perimeter, but their eyes were fixed on the desert to the east. "The LRDG dropped us 3 miles from the airfield," Thorne said. "I watched the SAS teams dismount. This was the moment where the thinking soldier philosophy became a physical reality. They didn't move in a line. They didn't use signals. Each 4-man team disappeared into the darkness, navigating by the rhythm of the airfield's searchlights. They carried the Lewes bombs in their pockets. They looked like ghosts returning to a graveyard they had already dug." Thorne stayed with the LRDG vehicles at the forming up point. He watched his watch. 0000, 0015, 0030. The silence was absolute, Thorne noted. In the American doctrine of the time, an attack began with a preparation fire, a bombardment to soften the target. But the SAS were practicing geometric neutralization. They were already inside the hangars. They were climbing onto the wings of the planes. They were placing the Lewes bombs directly over the engine blocks, where the thermite would melt through the cylinders and weld the pistons to the casing. Inside the Tamet airfield, Paddy Mayne and his team were moving with a speed that Thorne would later describe as biological overclocking. Mayne reached a line of 24 aircraft. Thorne recalled from the after-action debrief. He realized he didn't have enough bombs to kill them all, and the guards at the same time. In a normal unit, this is a resource failure. You withdraw. But Mayne performed a cognitive shift. He used his bombs on the first 12 planes. Then he ran into the pilot's mess hall, where the Germans were playing cards, and he stood in the doorway with a Thompson submachine gun. He didn't shout a warning. He didn't ask for a surrender. He performed a surgical removal of the human element while the bombs were doing the mechanical work outside. At 0:45, the night ended. The first Lewes bomb detonated, then the second, then the third. Within 60 seconds, Tamet Airfield turned into a pillar of fire. The acoustic shadow of the desert was shattered by the roar of exploding fuel tanks and the screams of a garrison that didn't know who was attacking them. "I saw the flashes on the horizon from 3 miles away," Thorne wrote. "It looked like a string of pearls being lit one by one. But it wasn't just fire. It was the arithmetic of the memo coming to life." In 45 minutes, 5 men had destroyed 24 combat aircraft. They had achieved more in an hour than the Royal Air Force had achieved in a month of bombing raids over the same sector. And they hadn't lost a single man. As the SAS team sprinted back to the LRDG trucks, Thorne saw the different species in their moment of evolution. They weren't cheering. They weren't celebrating. They were already checking their watches and calculating the distance to the next airfield at CERT. They were desynced from the emotion of the kill, Thorne observed. They treated the destruction of an air force like an accounting exercise. Stirling climbed into the truck next to me, his face blackened by cordite, and he said, "The geometry holds, Elias. The desert is officially ours." Thorne looked at the bedside memo he had once mocked. He realized that the industrialization of death he believed in had a fatal flaw. It was slow, it was heavy, and it was visible. The Germans had the Tiger tanks and the 88mm guns, Thorne concluded. But the British had a man with a broken back and a pencil who had figured out how to turn a 100-mile void into a 3-foot killing zone. I realized that night that Rommel wasn't losing a war. He was being deleted from the margins inward. But the Tamit miracle was just the beginning. The different species had proven they could kill. Now they had to prove they could survive the retaliation of a man who was quickly realizing that he was fighting ghosts. Erwin Rommel was about to unleash the full weight of the Luftwaffe to find the L-Detachment, and Major Elias Thorne was about to witness the moment where the thinking soldier has to decide if he is a ghost or just a man running out of sand. By the summer of 1942, the British problem in the desert had a name. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had begun referring to David Stirling in his private diaries as Der Phantom Major, the Phantom Major.
For Major Elias Thorne, still embedded as a tactical liaison, the shift in the atmosphere at Rommel's headquarters, monitored via Enigma intercepts, was a source of dark satisfaction. The Germans were no longer dismissive, Thorne wrote in his tactical diary. They were paranoid. Rommel had been forced to divert an entire Luftwaffe squadron and 2 motorized battalions, men he desperately needed for the push toward the Nile, just to guard his tail. He was trying to fight a war of mass and maneuver, but he was being bled to death by a ghost. But as the sun began to bake the Libyan sands in July 42, the ghost was about to put on armor. David Stirling had realized that while the surgical strike was efficient, the industrial massacre was necessary to break Rommel's back. The different species was undergoing a mechanical evolution. Stirling had grown tired of the LRDG taxis. They were too slow, too cautious, and too reliant on the acoustic shadow. He wanted a vehicle that matched the biological overclocking of his men. Stirling brought in the Willys Jeeps, Thorne recalled. To an American officer, the Jeep was a utility vehicle, a way to move officers and mail. But Stirling looked at the Jeep and saw a mobile weapon platform. He stripped them of their windshields, their bumpers, and their dignity. He loaded them with extra fuel tanks, 5-gallon water cans, and the most terrifying addition of all, the Vickers K machine gun. The Vickers K was a relic of the Royal Air Force, a high-speed gun designed to be mounted on biplanes. It fired at 1,200 rounds per minute, twice the speed of the standard infantry Bren gun. Stirling mounted them in pairs, 2 on the dashboard, 2 in the back. I told Stirling that an unarmored Jeep with 4 machine guns was a death trap, Thorne noted. I told him that the first German with an MP-40 would shred his men. Stirling just laughed. He said, "Elias, the armor is the speed. We don't intend to be there when they start shooting back. We are moving from the geometry of the knife to the geometry of the corridor of lead." The ultimate test of this new doctrine was the Sidi Haneish raid. Sidi Haneish was the primary staging hub for the Luftwaffe's Junkers Ju-52 transport fleet. It was the jugular vein of Rommel's logistics. The Germans, knowing the SAS were active, had turned the airfield into a fortress. They had 88mm flak guns leveled for ground fire, searchlights that swept the desert every 30 seconds, and a perimeter of barbed wire that looked like a solid wall. The Pentagon's planning models for an attack on Sidi Haneish required a division of infantry and a night bomber wing, Thorne wrote. Stirling proposed 18 jeeps and 70 men. I told him he was attempting a suicide charge that belonged in the 19th century. I told him that guts wouldn't survive a searchlight. But Stirling wasn't relying on guts. He was relying on the standard of the synchronized pulse. On the night of July 26, 1942, Thorne sat in the back of Stirling's lead jeep. The 18 vehicles moved across the desert in a V formation, their headlights off, their engines muffled by the vastness of the void. The discipline was chilling, Thorne recalled. 18 jeeps moving at 40 miles per hour, bumper to bumper, in total darkness. No radio chatter, no hand signals, They were navigating by the biological compass, the shared intuition of men who had lived in the sand for a year. We reached the perimeter of the airfield at 1 o'clock. The German searchlights were sweeping the dunes, but they were looking for mass. They were looking for trucks. They weren't looking for 18 low-profile shadows moving at the speed of a gale. Stirling didn't wait for a signal. He didn't fire a flare. He simply accelerated. "We hit the wire at 50 miles per hour, Thorne said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The jeeps didn't stop. They burst through the fence and formed two parallel columns, the corridor of lead. They drove down the center of the runway between the lines of parked Junkers and Messerschmitts, and then the Vickers Ks opened up. The sound was not the tat-tat-tat of a machine gun. It was a solid wall of white noise. 72 Vickers K guns firing at a combined rate of nearly 90,000 rounds per minute. "It looked like a laser show from hell," Thorne wrote. Every third round was a tracer. The air between the jeeps became a solid sheet of green and red fire. They weren't aiming at the planes. They were sewing them. They were cutting the wings off the Junkers with lead. I saw a German sentry try to raise a rifle. He was vaporized before he could even register the light. The searchlights swung toward us, but the tracers were so bright the German operators were blinded. We were moving in a bubble of fire that protected us more effectively than any steel plate. The Sidi Haneish raid lasted exactly 5 minutes. In those 300 seconds, the 18 jeeps destroyed 37 combat aircraft. They set the fuel dumps on fire. They neutralized the garrison. And as the German 88mm guns finally began to traverse toward the runway, Stirling gave the signal to dissolve. It was the Brecon exit, Thorne noted. One moment we were a roaring machine of death. The next, 18 jeeps turned 90 degrees and vanished into the darkness in 18 different directions. The Germans were left firing at their own burning planes. By the time the dust settled, we were 5 miles away, regrouping in an acoustic shadow that the Luftwaffe couldn't penetrate. But as the adrenaline receded, Thorne began to see the biological decay that he had first noticed in Belfast and Baghdad in his future assessments. He looked at Stirling's men. They were covered in grease, blood, and the grey dust of the desert. Their eyes were wide, fixed and empty. They were losing their connection to the normal, Thorne observed. They had spent too long in the 17-second window. They had become so efficient at processing the abyss that they no longer knew how to be men. I saw Paddy Mayne sitting on the hood of his jeep, cleaning a Vickers K. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't boasting. He looked like a man who had seen the end of the world and found it boring. The cost of being a different species was finally mounting. On the withdrawal from Sidi Haneish, the Luftwaffe launched a retaliatory audit. 40 Messerschmitts swept the desert for 3 days, looking for the jeeps. "We lived under the hammer of the sky," Thorne recalled. "We hid the jeeps under cam nets and lay in the sand for 16 hours a day, not moving, not talking, watching the German planes fly so low we could see the pilot's goggles." This was the thinking soldier at his limit. You can't fight a plane with a jeep during the day. You can only out-endure it. One man in our group, a young trooper named Jenkins, couldn't take the silence. He tried to run for a wadi. He was spotted. The Messerschmitts dived. I watched as the different species handled the compromise. Stirling didn't try to save Jenkins. He didn't reveal the position of the other 17 jeeps. He watched, with the same institutional patience that would define the SAS for 80 years, as the Messerschmitts shredded the runner. It was a cold calculation, Thorne wrote. The mission over the individual. The standard over the life.
I realized then that David Stirling hadn't just built a unit. He had built a ritual of attrition. And as the sun set over the Libyan plateau, I realized that Rommel was right to be afraid. Because you can kill a soldier, but you can't kill a ghost that has already accepted its own death. The bedside memo was no longer a piece of paper. It was a geometry of the void that was winning the war.
But the final part of the story wasn't the victory at Sidi Haneish. It was the legacy of the Shadow Major. As the war moved toward Tunisia, the SAS was about to face a trap that even the thinking soldier couldn't think his way out of. And Major Elias Thorne was about to witness the moment where the Phantom Major finally encountered the limit of his own audacity. The capture of David Stirling in January 1943 was not a failure of the geometry of the shadow. It was, as Major Elias Thorne later noted in his final surgical audit for the Pentagon, a statistical inevitability. For 18 months, Stirling had operated in the blind spots of the German army, surviving on a mixture of aristocratic audacity and environmental luck. But in the jagged hills of Tunisia, the acoustic shadow finally evaporated. The Phantom Major was caught because he refused to believe in the word limit, Thorne recalled. He was trying to force a link-up between the 8th Army coming from the east and the American 1st Army coming from the west. He moved through a narrow valley near the Gabes Gap, a place where the desert logic of the wide open void didn't apply. The Germans, specifically a unit of the Sonderkommando Dora, had been studying Stirling's rhythm for a year. They didn't look for his dust, they looked for his arrogance. They found him sleeping in a wadi. The man who had deleted 300 planes was neutralized by a single patrol with a radio. Thorne was not with Stirling when he was captured. He was at the SAS forward base at Burat, watching the Enigma intercepts turn from static to a terrifying clarity. The room went silent when the word came through, Thorne wrote. To the Pentagon, the SAS was David Stirling. We assumed that without the Phantom Major, the bedside fantasy would dissolve. We thought the unit would be folded back into the conventional infantry. But I watched the men of the SAS, men like Paddy Mayne and Jock Lewis's successors, when they heard the news. There was no panic, there were no tears, they didn't even stop cleaning their rifles. I realized then the most terrifying truth about the different species. Stirling hadn't just built a unit, he had built a self-correcting standard. The man was gone, but the software remained. The transition from Stirling to Paddy Mayne was the moment the SAS became a permanent fixture of modern warfare. If Stirling was the architect of audacity, Mayne was the engineer of slaughter. Stirling's raids were theatre, Thorne observed. Mayne's raids were surgery. He removed the flamboyance and replaced it with a volcanic efficiency. Under Mayne, the SAS stopped being a band of pirates and became a biological weapon system. I told my superiors in Washington, do not disband them. They have achieved a per capita lethality that our doctrine cannot even measure. One SAS trooper is now producing more strategic disruption than an entire armored brigade. Major Elias Thorne returned to the United States in April 1943. He was summoned to a closed-door briefing at the Department of War, facing a panel of generals who were obsessed with the hardware of the coming invasion of Europe. They wanted to know about the SAS's jeeps, their explosives, and their radios. I stood in front of those men, Thorne recalled, and I realized they were looking for a secret weapon they could manufacture in a factory in Detroit. I told them, "Generals, you are looking at the wrong variable. The secret isn't the jeep. The secret is the flattening. The British have figured out how to take a man, strip away his ego, his fear, and his dependency on the machine, and rebuild him as a sensor of the void. They have created a soldier who doesn't need us. He doesn't need our logistics, our orders, or our support. He only needs the mission." Thorne's report was filed away as Tactical Observation Irregular.
The United States military proceeded with its industrial strategy, winning the war through the sheer volume of B-17 and Sherman tanks. It was a successful strategy, but it was one that Thorne realized would eventually hit a wall in the grey wars of the future. I told them that one day the planes wouldn't be able to fly and the satellites would be jammed. Thorne wrote in his final entry, I told them that in that hour we would be begging for the bedside memo. We would be looking for the man who can walk 40 miles in a storm and clear a room in 17 seconds using nothing but his own pulse as a clock. David Stirling survived the war. He escaped from German prisoner of war camps 4 times, eventually being sent to Colditz Castle, the high-security grave for the British Empire's most troublesome officers. Even in a cell, he remained a ghost. He spent his time planning a private army for the post-war world, a dream that would eventually manifest as the modern 22nd SAS. I met Stirling one last time in London in 1960, Thorne said. We sat in a quiet club on Pall Mall. He was older. His back still pained him, but his eyes were still focused on the blind spots of the map. I asked him if he ever regretted the hospital bed. The moment he decided to break the rules of war, he looked at me with that quiet, institutional patience and said, Elias, the rules are just a consensus of the weak. The desert doesn't have rules. It only has a standard. And as long as you maintain the standard, you never truly lose. Thorne realized then that the different species wasn't just a military unit.
It was a philosophy of persistent individualism. It was the belief that the ultimate force multiplier isn't a machine, but a human being who has been flattened until there is nothing left but the thinking soldier. The bedside memo remains the most important document in the history of special operations. It is the genetic code for the Iranian embassy, for Pebble Island, for the alleys of Belfast, and the mountains of Tora Bora. It is the reason why, 80 years later, the British SAS still arrives with a third of the gear and twice the result. Major Elias Thorne retired to a quiet life in Virginia, but he never stopped looking at the blind spots. On his desk, he kept a copy of Stirling's original 1941 memo. People asked me why I'm so skeptical of our modern, high-tech military, Thorne concluded in his final interview. I tell them that I've seen the alternative. I've seen what 40 men can do when they stop believing in the machine and start believing in the sand. I tell them that in the abyss, the algorithm will fail you, but the man who has been through the beacons, he will find you in the dark. As the sun sets over Stirling lines in Hereford today, a new generation of candidates is looking at a hospital bed in their minds. They are being told that they are nothing. They are being pushed into the rain, into the mud, and into the void. Most will fail. The Brecon filter will catch them. But those who pass through, those who become another species, they will remember the geometry of the sand. They will remember 17 seconds. And they will remember the note written by the man with the broken spine who refused to die in silence. Because for the SAS, history is just a series of Tuesdays, and who dares, wins.